Topeka, Kansas from 1952 to 1970. And then in 1970, I went back to Boston where I had been born, had been raised. And almost immediately got involved in some political and particularly women's issues. I moved into Brookline, Massachusetts, and became a member of the Brookline Democratic Committee, which is Michael Dukakis's political base. So I was active in that. But my oldest childhood friend was Norma Maris Swenson, who was a member of the Boston Women's Health Book Collective, which in 1969, just before I moved back, had their very first meeting. The group of women got together and they were concerned about the fact that all of them had found that many physicians were not very sympathetic to women's health and medical issues. And they got together actually to try to draw up a list of recommended physicians, and found that they could not do that because a physician that one person really had confidence in and liked and had a good experience with, another woman felt the exact opposite about that same physician. So instead, what they decided to do was to put together some information about various health issues for women, feeling that there wasn't enough accurate and helpful information available to the public at that time. And women, many women had been raised to not ask questions, to not challenge, etc. So the first thing that they then put out was a little paper, just a little paper pamphlet. But very quickly they went to published books. And I was never a member of the Boston Women's Health Book Collective, but I'm one of the cast of thousands that helped on various editions, and I'll go into that a little bit later. In the 60s, there were a lot of consciousness-raising groups that started out. I was never actually a member of a consciousness-raising group, but I did become a member of several different women's support groups that developed out of that understanding of how much women get by meeting together and being supportive and etc. I think probably Alcoholics Anonymous probably has a little bit of an influence on that history, that there's many things that people can do together in a group no other way. So one of the first things I was involved with was when I was working in the cancer control program at Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, and that would have been 1974. And we wanted to start a support group for breast cancer patients in Western Massachusetts. And the physicians were all opposed to it. Well, not all of them. Most of the physicians were opposed to it because at that time, a lot of people were running off to Mexico to get Laetrile to treat cancer. It's a substance found in almonds. It's of no use whatsoever. I mean, almonds happen to be a healthy food, but you can't cure breast cancer with it. Well, we finally got enough physicians that agreed to it, and it turned out to be a very, very, very helpful group. None of the patients stopped treatment and ran off for phony cures, but it turned out to be very good. Then on as a private citizen, I've always been the kind of person that dealt with what clobbered me in life. But I was coming up to menopause, and I didn't know anything about it. And I decided that instead of waiting until something happened that I was going to find out more. And I had found a whole group of women, and we all felt the same way. And so we formed the Menopause Collective. And we did a lot of reading and a lot of interviewing, and as we went through menopause, we did a lot of talking about how we were reacting to it, what was happening to us physically, what was happening to us in every way. We wrote some articles, and we did some questions, answers, we did some workshops, and then, and I think it was probably the 1974 edition of Our Bodies, Ourselves, had the first chapter on menopause. Before that, they didn't. And so we contributed to that chapter. And I also, having worked at the Dana-Farber Cancer Center, helped a little bit with the cancer chapter. So then the way our book developed was that the member of the collective, Paula Doris Waters, and I had gotten along very well in working on it, and she felt that here was this whole book on women's health with just one chapter on aging. And that really there should be a whole book on it. And she and I had gotten along very well and together, and so we decided to work on it. And that's how Ourselves Growing Older developed. Another support group that I got involved in later on, much later on in the 80s and early 90s, was that some of us we felt we were having problems with our adult children. And so a bunch of us women got together to have a little support group about our relationships with our adult children. And it was very, very helpful. And all of us experienced improved relations with our children. I'll give you one tiny example. One woman in particular wrote a letter to her daughter, really blowing off steam. But before she mailed it, she brought it to the group and read it to the group. And her best friend in the group said to her, "I understand everything that you're writing in that letter." She said, "But if I were your daughter and you wrote me that letter, I would never speak to you again. Don't send that letter." So, she didn't. She found other ways to deal with situations, and all of the relationships with all of the adult children improved as a result of our group. I was involved in the Women's Pentagon Action. I've marked on this outline where you can get some information about it. So here's the Women's Pentagon Action. I think it was November 17th of 1980, gathered in Washington, D.C., and marched from D.C. through the Arlington Cemetery to ring the Pentagon and protest to the actions going on. 1980, rather. And I found one picture. I know I have others, but I couldn't find any more, and I have a button from that. Another way that I got involved was with the Older Women's League. That was a group started by two women in San Francisco who again felt that not enough attention was being paid. It was more of a lobbying group and an educational group, but they had very specific goals about ending employment discrimination against older women. They did accomplish a lot of things. For example, they got that if a couple divorces, if they've been married for more than 10 years, the woman gets a share of the man's Social Security, which was very important for older women. They did a lot of very good legislation. When I came back to Topeka in 2005, there was a chapter of the Older Women's League in Lawrence called the Kaw Valley Owl, which I became a member of. There was never a chapter here in Topeka. But the Older Women's League has ended. It's no longer in existence, but you can get details on the internet. So those are some of the things that I did. I did write some articles through the years, but I think mainly ourselves growing older did not have the same degree of exposure and sales as our bodies ourselves. Our bodies ourselves has been written in many languages in many countries around the world, and so has had really a major effect in the whole issue of women gaining control of their own bodies. We had publications printed in Great Britain, in Spain, and in Germany, but they were not done by groups of women in those countries getting together and writing their own books. They were essentially done by one author, not doing a straight translation, again modifying for the culture and the practices in that country. So that's my story.
I had read in an article.
I'm very hard of hearing.
Okay.
You'll have to speak clearly.
Okay. I read in an article about you by, I think, Jeffrey Goody.
Yeah, I have it right here.
About you working as a research assistant at Minegar's.
That was way back in the 1950s.
Would you be able to speak about it a little bit, though?
I came to Kansas in September of 1952 as a graduate student in clinical psychology at KU. I had done my undergraduate work. I was in the first graduating class at Brandeis University, and my psychology professor was Dr. Abraham Maslow, who's very well known in the field of psychology. And he recommended that two of us who graduated in that class apply to KU. KU at that time had the best clinical psychology program in the United States. So I came out for that, and I did manage to get a plum job. I think maybe I should tell this story, because for women's issues it's really important. We each were as new students, we were scheduled for an individual appointment with the chair of the psychology department, Dr. Alfred Baldwin. And everybody was very nervous about having a meeting with the chair of the department. And I went in, and he was sitting behind his desk smoking his pipe. And somehow I looked at him, and I thought to myself, he may be the chair of the department, but this is a basically shy man. And I walked in, and I went up to the desk, and I held out my hand, and I said, Dr. Baldwin, I'm Diana Laskin. I'm very happy to meet you. And I sat down. He hardly asked me anything. So I just started talking. And I just said the things that I thought he should ask me. Now, I was 20 years old. I was very young, and I'm not that outgoing a person, but somehow or other. And I told him why I had majored in psychology, what my experience at Brandeis was, how grateful I was to Dr. Abraham Maslow and Jim Cleave for the good foundation they gave me, why I came to KU, what I expected to get out of it, what I thought he would ask me. And when I thought I had talked enough, I stood up again. He said a few things, but hardly anything. Held out my hand again and said, "Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to my time here." Turned around and walked out.
Oh, wow.
Well, when one of the the directors of a research project at Menningers called Al Baldwin and said, "I have an opening for a research assistant on a research project. Do you have somebody you can recommend?" He recommended me.
Right.
So I took a bus over from Lawrence to Topeka, took the bus from the bus station to Menningers, all dressed up the way you were supposed to in 1952. I had stockings on, I had gloves, didn't have a hat because I never wore a hat, but I had gloves on. I get out to North Office at Menningers. I walk in, and here's this guy in jeans and sneakers and a sweatshirt with his feet up on the desk. So I quickly took off my gloves and and got the job.
Oh, yeah.
As it turned out, I didn't finish my master's degree. I did what women were expected to do in the 1950s. I married a psychologist instead of becoming one. But later on, I went back to KU in the public administration program because I had gotten very involved in the League of Women Voters and did lobbying and so forth. And I thought, no, I think I'd like to go into public administration and run the programs, be on the other side of the desk instead of lobbying all these people. And actually, I was the first woman to get a master's in public administration in that program, and did my internship in the new health planning office under the Kansas Board of Health. So then when I went back to Boston, I worked in public health, not as a practitioner, not as a nurse or physician, but as a grant writer and program developer, etc. So that's my background in
Okay, so where were you living in the 70s and 80s, and what was the city or town like?
When I went back to Boston, I moved into Brookline, Massachusetts, which is a little township. It's got its own government and its own school. It's inserted right in Boston. So you wouldn't know as you're driving through where Boston ends and Brookline begins. So I moved into Brookline.
Okay.
With my kids.
I
was a widow by that time.
Oh,
so
okay.
Single parent.
What events of the 70s or 80s do you think were most important, and why?
The most important in general?
Yeah.
I think, I think the whole women's movement and, the various aspects of it, the political aspects of it, the whole anti-war, anti-nuclear weapons part of it. And I think the whole women's health movement I think had great effects, which continue. The Boston Women's Health Book Collective has disbanded. They are basically no longer. But the National Women's Health Network is 40 years old. And the collective was more focused toward education in the broadest sense, and the empowerment that education brings. The National Women's Health Network does a little bit of education in that they have you ever seen their newsletter? They have a newsletter that has some topics in it, but they do much more lobbying work. For example, they did a lot against the super-sized Tampax that caused infections. They do a lot on the safety of birth control, drug. They do a lot of testifying on drug issues. For example, that drug that came out, name I'm not going to remember, a couple years ago, that was supposed to increase women's sexual drive, but had very bad side effects. That's the kind of work that they do, and they're still very much in existence.
So with women's health, like educating and everything, you kind of addressed birth control. What exactly were they doing for education for women? Like, how did they educate the women about birth control? Okay.
By publishing our bodies ourselves in many changing editions from 1970 until the most recent. Oh, I thought I brought it, but I guess I left it at home. The last one I think was 2004. I think was the last edition. After that, because Simon & Schuster was no longer interested in publishing books with multiple subjects. So they did one that was just on menopause, and they did a few others on single subjects, but they have pretty much disbanded now.
Okay. So with the women's health, I know a lot has changed, but what do you think the most important parts have changed since the 1970s to now?
Well, you've got some issues that have not been resolved, and certainly issues of sex education, issues of women's choice about abortion. I mean, we've got the Supreme Court ruling in Roe versus Wade, but the anti-choice movement has undertaken the tactic of going state by state, and they've gradually whittled away. Now, we all wish that every pregnancy was a wanted, healthy pregnancy, but it's just not true. And I believe that women should have a choice as to what they do with their bodies. And it's worse now than it was earlier. So that's still a major issue, and you still have issues of needing to be very careful about approval of drugs. Drug costs have gone up ridiculously. I mean, to take drugs like insulin and stuff, and for the price to triple, there's absolutely no excuse for that. I mean, that's just greed on the part of the drug companies. So we've got a lot of issues like that. And access, the general access, what can be done to make sure that everybody in the country has access to health care. We haven't solved that problem. The Affordable Care Act has helped, and some people have insurance they never did before, but we're still fighting in Kansas about expanding Medicaid. I mean, the House passed it the other day, but what's the, Governor Kelly will sign it, but will the Senate pass it? Will they present her with a bill? So there's still a lot of major health issues.
So my last question is, what effects do you think women's organizing in the 70s and 80s had for future generations?
Well, I would have to ask you all that. I mean, I know what happened in the 70s and 80s, but I don't know how it has influenced the rest of you. I just finished reading Michelle Obama's autobiography, and I found it very interesting that, for example, she doesn't say anything about the women's movement in any way at all, except that when she was a young mother in Chicago, she had a very supportive group of other mothers. And when she became the president's wife and moved to Washington, D.C., she had a group of mothers in the school that her daughters went to that was really a support group among those mothers. So without giving any history, without acknowledging that there was much about the women's movement that created the opportunity for those kinds of support groups, she had those groups, both in Chicago and in Washington. So I'm hoping that the younger generation has more support, does more things. They don't have to know the history as long as they're doing it.
Right.
But I don't know. I mean, I think it's good that you're studying the history. What do they say? Those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it, you know.
Yeah.
But you're the ones that are going to have to answer that question. I don't know what it's like to be a young person. I just do think the world is very different for each generation. My mother's generation, it was very different than my generation, and it's different for you all. So I just hope that the good things learned out of the 70s and 80s continues and grows. And anything I can do to help, I'll do.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And if you have nothing else to add, I think that will be the end of our...
Okay. As it turned out, I've got Jeffries. Did you see her article?
Yes, I have.
Yeah, well,
Yep.
it just so happened that popped up.
Yeah.
I have, I don't know what you want to do about taking you can have this cover.
Okay.
That you can have.
I'm sure Dr. Wen would be very excited about this.
Yeah.
Okay. I don't know if you want to take pictures of the first edition,
Yeah.
or any of the others.
We can show them to her
I
and see what
have
she got to do.
Jeffrey's article. I also have an article. One of the most fun jobs I ever had was after I was married and just before my kids were born, when they built the new library on 10th Street. The old library downtown had been a closed Stax library.
Yeah.
The new library was open Stax. And the head of adult services hired 3 of us who were not trained librarians to be readers' assistants. My background was primarily social sciences. There was another older woman who was like English and American Lit, and another woman who'd been a school teacher, and it was like education, and the 3 of us. And our jobs were to make sure that patrons went home with books they enjoyed. We were like clerks in the library. I mean, we did shelving, we did the reference work, which was great fun. But then if somebody was wandering about the library, we were to go up and offer to help them and so forth. And so I did that for a year, and it was the most fun job I have ever had. So I wrote after the book was published, I wrote to the library. Where's that letter? I thought I put a paper clip. Here it is. I wrote to the Topeka Public Library, and I sent them a copy, 87. And I have a letter from James Marvin, who was the librarian at the time. So I don't know if you want that, it's just kind of fun. Because they put it in the Topeka Room collection, which is Topeka authors. So it's supposed to be there. Because it's not in print any longer. I mean, you can get them on Amazon, it's not in print. And it's not in the regular circulating library any longer, but it's up in the room. And then there was the TPR from Vinegar Foundation published a notice that as a former staff member. So those are the 3 pieces I have of publicity that show anything about Topeka.
Okay.
I don't know if you want them, and if you don't, that's all right.
We can talk to Dr. Wynn and see if we can get them scanned in
Okay.
and then digitize them for you
Yeah.
as well.
Okay, but I can't take them out. I mean, if you,
Okay.
Okay.
'cause they're glued in. Yeah, I can't get them out.
We should be able to lay them over the scanner.
Mhm.
Right.
So,
It'll work.
Okay.
okay. Well, I will stop the recording.
So this is a course under